So as I said, I'm executive editor Stephen Lacey. For those who don't know, Latitude Media is a B2B media research and events company. We cover tech deals and markets in clean energy with an emphasis on the power sector. And that is everything from solar batteries, virtual power plants, grid enhancing tech, AI applications in energy, AI power demand, and other grid edge technologies. And so if you want to watch this event after it's done, or to watch and listen to some of our previous live events, things like the transferable tax credit market, AI energy demand, the greenhouse gas reduction fund, innovations in rate design, go to latitudemedia.com/events. And so definitely feel free to go back and rewatch this video if there's stuff that you want to visit, to rewatch. We will also have an edited version of this on our podcast feeds. We want to hear from you. We have a Q&A box that you can submit questions to, and I'm going to sprinkle those throughout the conversation. So as we get probably halfway through, I'll start integrating some of those questions. Before I get started, Seth, are you recording on Audacity?
I am.
Okay, great. So with that, let's talk about virtual power plants, how to design them, how to deploy them. One of my favorite quotes about virtual power plants comes from Jen Downing, a senior advisor at the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, and she's one of the people leading VPP efforts there. I interviewed her earlier this year about the state of the market, and in defining VPPs, she said she likes to call them the sandwich for the electric grid. She said that there are a lot of different kinds, they're full of different ingredients, and they serve lots of different purposes. So I looked up the most iconic sandwiches for each state. And in Arizona, where we are going to be focusing our discussion, there is a very heated debate, it turns out, over what the state's unofficial sandwich actually is. Is it a torta, a Navajo taco, a Sonoran hot dog? We don't have time to go into what each of those is or if they actually qualify as sandwiches, but they do all have something in common. They are hot and they are spicy. And that is also true for Arizona's virtual power plants, which need to serve an increasingly intense summertime peak as extreme temperatures and humidity grip the Southwest. In the next 5 years, Arizona Public Service estimates peak demand will grow by 40%, and it is increasingly turning to demand-side flexibility to meet that peak. And we are going to dig into how APS and EnergyHub have structured their VPP. What does APS's experience tell us about what's working and what's missing in VPP program design around the country? How do we convince utilities that VPPs are reliable? What is their role as load growth rises? And how do we define them in the first place? So here with me to dig into that are Seth Frater-Thompson. Seth is the co-founder and president of EnergyHub, and Carrie Carnes, the director of customer to grid solutions at Arizona Public Service. Seth co-founded EnergyHub in 2007. The company pioneered bring your own thermostat programs. It now works with 70 utilities that are using its distributed energy resource management system. And a fun fact about Seth, he worked on robotics projects at NASA and a miniature laser vision system for search and rescue robots at DARPA. Seth, welcome.
Thank you. Fun to be here.
The world wants to know, will laser vision be integrated into future VPPs?
I think that's like on the 5 to 10 year horizon, probably not next 3.
Carrie Carnes has been at APS since 2003, where she worked across nuclear, transmission and distribution construction, regulation, and customer technology. And as director of customer to grid solutions, she focuses on DERs and demand side flexibility and microgrids. Carrie, welcome. Good to see you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
When you started working at APS in the early 2000s, was the term VPP even on your radar?
No, absolutely not. I was asked this question recently, and breaking technology in 2003 was a scanner. It was like mind blowing that I could scan documents and store them on a little disk at the time. They wanted me to order some additional file cabinets to store documents. And I was like, we have computers, let's use them. And they were like, wow, that's smart. And then I scanned documents for 9 months straight. It was the worst thing ever.
That's like, you should have that written like on your desk or something. We have computers. Let's use them.
Computers. Let's use them.
So Seth, you started EnergyHub in 2007 with a focus on residential demand response. And as I said, you work with 70 utilities in North America to manage more than 1.7 gigawatts of flexible capacity. How has that resource mix changed over time? And then when did you start framing this flexible capacity as virtual power plants?
Yeah, so we've been working on the sort of kind of call it multi-product, what we now call a DERMS since probably 2012. And so that started off focusing on thermostats because there were just a lot of thermostats and there weren't a lot of other DERs for a long time. And so probably somewhere around, 500,000, 750,000, we started to see other classes of DERs emerge, started to see batteries, EV chargers, EVs, heat pumps, et cetera. So the resource mix today is still numerically probably heaviest in thermostats, but there's a fair amount of C&I load, and there's now actually a fair amount of battery and EV load on the platform. And so what we saw in the early days was utilities started doing pilots where they would work with a handful of manufacturers independently, and at some point they would reach critical mass. They would say, all right, we need a single platform to manage all of this in one place. And so they came to us with that for thermostats, and then the same thing has now happened with other classes of DERs.
So tell me about APS's unique load flexibility needs and the origins of your collaboration with them.
Yeah, I mean, Carrie, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think we started working under this somewhat awkwardly named program called DRESLM back. There was a regulatory order from the Arizona Commission back in 2016. And that was essentially just try customer-sided resources with a focus on demand response and energy storage. And that went well. And then I think around the same time, new leadership came into APS, and they decided to just generally double down on what is now customer to grid. And I mean, it's kind of interesting, just the fact that there is a team called customer to grid kind of indicates how important that's become for Arizona. Obviously, Arizona has very unique challenges related to, where they are in the desert. But there are other interesting challenges about the fact that they're right next to California, which has a bunch of interesting effects. And so, it's been kind of an interesting journey.
So, Carrie, in 2016, you started focusing on peak load management. And at that time, as you told me, you heard from other teams inside APS saying that what you were doing was cute, and there was skepticism that it wouldn't become a real resource. What was that lack of trust or belief in the resource like?
Yeah, so I think, the reality is when we first started, it was small, right? And so from a resource operations perspective, and I sat on the trading desk, I ran our real-time trading organizations for several years, and I get it. 20 megawatts, that feels like noise to them, right? And so we had to really build trust in this as a real resource. And as we grew the resource, as it got bigger, and you could see a noticeable difference when we called on these devices, that trust really began to build. So much so that it went from that's cute, come back when you're a real thing, to, a couple of years later, them asking, how much can you bring us? How quickly can you grow this resource? Because it's a valuable resource to us now.
Where was that distrust coming from? Like what teams?
So I think that, our planners typically are rather conservative, and they have to be, because we have to make sure that we've got all of the resources lined up to meet customer demand in advance of when that demand shows up. And so until a resource or a new technology is proven, they're going to be rightfully skeptical about that.
Hmm. It's kind of funny, right? I mean, we almost put ourselves at a disadvantage by calling it a virtual power plant, which in a way almost makes it sound like it's not a real power plant. And so you have this initial issue of, okay, well, is this real? Like, where's the data to prove that this thing is reliable? But then what's interesting is that a VPP is actually more capable in some ways than a traditional power plant, right? Like a traditional power plant can only export real power to the bulk system. It's not distributed, whereas a VPP is very distributed. And that's interesting because you don't call things that you dispatch on the distribution system power plants. You call that something else, but we're just using this term VPP. And my guess is that over the next few years, we'll probably come up with some more sort of nuanced things to call VPPs.
Carrie, do you think, is it a helpful term? What do you think about
Well,
the language
I,
does matter for sure.
language does matter. And I think that it's continually evolving and it's going to Seth's point, it's going to change as we learn and develop these assets out more. But I really agree. It's more of a distributed power plant. And if power plant is even the right term, but it is real and it does show up the way that we expect it to. And so I agree that I think that the word virtual causes people to be a little bit more, curious about whether or not it's going to function the way that we expect it to.
And so when that trust evolved, was it a particular event where the VPP proved itself? Was it a series of events? Was it just the level of scale? What actually changed?
So, I'm sure you may have seen, it's been national news. We keep breaking records in Arizona for the hottest summer ever. It's like every summer is the new hottest summer ever. And so during the pandemic, on top of everything else that Arizonans were dealing with, we had another really extreme heat summer. And at the same time, we were also reaching a larger scale of the asset, and it continued to show up. We had to call on it several times that summer, and it functioned exactly in the way that we expected it to. And so that really kind of cemented it as an asset for us, as a real asset that we can depend on those days when the system needs the support the most. And for us, we like to think about it, it's not just supporting reliability. We also view our virtual power plant as a significant affordability act saver for our customers, essentially, right? We didn't have to go to the market and buy expensive power on the real-time market. And we didn't have to start a traditional power plant or conventional generation unit that day. So we also saved money on fuel. And so for all those reasons, we really view the virtual power plant as affordability for our customers, not just reliability.
And Seth, from your perspective, what was the turning point and what is it reflective of how other utilities become open to this resource?
I think sort of in the aftermath, it's reflective. I think APS tends to do a lot of these things first. They tend to be kind of right on the bleeding edge of what's possible, and then also kind of right on they tend to be sort of on any metric, like, per capita, the size of the program, the scale, how frequently they're using the resource. They tend to be first. So I think but I think other utilities have followed in their footsteps. I think this question of trust, in a lot of ways, it's just like how many, it's like anything, just sort of practice makes perfect. It's like how many touches do you have on the ball in a game? You have folks who are on Carrie's team who sort of live and breathe VPPs all day. But then if you're thinking about a planner, someone on the markets and trading team, someone in an operations function, they need to have sort of seen for themselves that there is this track record. And I think it's interesting. I was talking to a client the other day we've been working together for 10 years, but it was a brand new audience within that client. And one of the execs asked, like, this sounds great. I just need to know, how much do I derate this in my plan? Like, should I derate it by 50% or by 90%? And I was like, well, hang on. Like, I could show you data from literally tens of thousands of events showing that this thing is 99.9+% reliable. And not only do you have to trust that, or not only can you trust that the platform works, but there's all these backups and other mechanisms that you use to do resource assurance that are sort of similar to the way utilities do contingency planning. And so, the data's there, but the reality is the first time someone comes into this, they don't have years of hands-on experience with it. And so I think that's where we are as an industry, is new people are getting that hands-on experience. You can get them up to a point with data, but at some point they've just got to drive the car.
And a reminder, feel free to riff on each other if you want to respond to each other's points. Carrie, and we talked a little bit about the resource makeup. Can you got tens of thousands of DERs, go into more detail about what that resource mix looks like and how it could evolve?
Yeah, absolutely. So today, we're nearing 200 megawatts in our virtual power plant. The bulk of that, as Seth said, is thermostats by far. this summer, we achieved 163 megawatts with the thermostats. We also have commercial and industrial demand response in the portfolio, residential battery storage, as well as behavioral demand response. But we also, at a point in time, had water heaters in the portfolio. We had some communications challenges with those assets, so we actually shut that down. But we also are looking forward to, as communication protocols improve and we can bring those types of assets back in, we're not going to foreclose the idea. We want to be thinking about how can we bring pool pumps into the portfolio as well. We've got a lot of pools in our service territory. And then, of course, electric vehicles. We're really excited to be transitioning our EV work over to EnergyHub, kind of keeping everything in one spot within our resource operating platform so that we can get smarter about the way in which we dispatch events, leveraging the different technologies.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is that as you round out the resource pool, you start to be able to kind of do more with the VPP than what any given class of DER can do on its own. So, for example, if you have a mix of thermostats and batteries and EVs, you can figure out what time of day is each of these sort of most effective. You can do, instead of, if you're talking about what is today sort of an event-driven framework, you can move from short events to long events. So instead of a 3 or 4 hour event, you can now do an 8-hour event. And over time, that kind of creeps you toward what I think will be a 24/7, 365 kind of expectations of VPPs. The other thing that I want to mention that I think is remarkable about the Phoenix area is that APS is closing in on 10% of their customers participating in these VPP programs, which is like 2 to 3x what we see sort of as a national average. So what's amazing about that is you've got one of the most unforgiving climates in the country, but 1 in 10 customers is choosing to participate in these programs. There's a million reasons why people could choose not to participate, but they choose to participate over and over and over again. And when you survey customers who are participating in these VPP programs are more enthusiastic. They have a higher opinion of their utility than an average customer of that utility. So it's one of these things where you're asking more of them, but somehow the opportunity to be part of the solution is actually leading to higher customer sat.
What do they care about? Do they want savings? Do they want to compete to see how well they do? Do they want to help the broader grid? What is the general response?
Yeah, I would say it's probably a little bit of all of those, right? It's very
Yeah.
unique. Each customer has a different driver, but certainly it doesn't hurt to get a bill credit on your September bill in the desert during the summertime, right? So it's a variety of that. But I think the other thing that's really important is, we are so committed to keeping the customer at the front of everything that we do. And so making sure that we're regularly going out and hearing the voice of the customer and then incorporating that into our program design, it's something that my team is just incredibly passionate about. We really want to make sure that we're not developing a program, pushing it out into the universe, and then moving on to the next thing. We want to keep going back and checking in on that. And as we continue to scale this asset, that will be even more important, because as we grow it and it becomes a larger component of our overall resource mix, we need to make sure that we're keeping customers satisfied so that they stay enrolled and participate year after year after year. And so we can't let up on the customer centricity and thinking about the program development lifecycle and what does that mean? What works for them? What do their need? How do their needs and desires change over time? And to make sure that we're pivoting with them, growing with them, essentially.
Can we talk a little bit more about the evolution of the resource mix? My understanding, Carrie, is that there has been some debate over how to include distributed generation, batteries specifically. What is APS's view on batteries specifically as a VPP tool? And what has been the back and forth with the battery and solar industry on that?
So we definitely think that all customer-sided resources have a place in APS's virtual power plant. Absolutely, right? The reality is customers are adopting a variety of technologies, and we want to have a program ready for that asset to participate in, because we really truly view it as a win-win, right? It is supporting the reliable operation of our grid in a way that supports affordability for all customers, whether you're participating or not. And so we think that's incredibly important. We also, though, think that it's important to make sure that we fully understand how each technology functions in our service territory, how our customers engage with those technologies, and then we also want to be thinking about, as it relates to program design, what impact might this have on our customers, right? At the end of the day, customer satisfaction has to be at the forefront of everything that we do. And while we think of this as a virtual power plant, it's not the same thing as I call for a start on a combined cycle, right? When we call on the virtual power plant, there are customers on the other end of that. And so we really want to make sure that before we kind of scale rapidly any one specific technology, that we're understanding that. And I also think that the impact to the customer varies based on the technology, right? The impacts from a battery event are very different than in the impacts from a thermostat event or even an EV event, especially in a service territory like APS's, where we're extremely dependent on our cars. Most of our service territory is not walkable. And so we want to make sure that as we're thinking about those active managed charging programs, how can we call events? How can we develop the program in a way that still enables the customers to make the choice that works for them and their families?
Yeah, I mean, to pick up on the battery point, batteries, if you ignore the customer, a battery is an infinitely flexible resource, right? It can perform more or less the same under any circumstances. It can respond in milliseconds. It can do things. It can do kind of inverter-based control, or it can do bulk power control. When you layer in the customer, it can do even more. APS has a pretty meaningful time of use rate. So they've got, I don't know, like a 3 or 4 to 1 spread between an off-peak and an on-peak rate. So if you take a battery and you say, okay, you can use this battery to manage your exposure to peak rates and minimize your bill, that's sort of step one. And then if you layer in, and then you can sort of rent access to the battery to the utility for them to dispatch for a variety of reasons, you unlock more value for the battery, you unlock more value for the customer, you unlock more value for the grid. So I love batteries for that. I think EVs are going to be another one, because you don't have a lot of batteries plugged in, or sorry, you don't have a lot of EVs plugged in during the traditional sort of summer late afternoon peak, but you have tons of EVs that are plugged in the overnight period, and school buses you may have available during the afternoon peak. And so you start putting these together and you start to say, oh, I have a ton of flexibility for when I charge this car in the middle of the night. I have the ability to do maybe V to G on school buses in the late afternoon that I can layer in with batteries and thermostats. You can put all this stuff together and do something pretty special.
Hmm. So I want to get into some big picture questions and also additional utility learnings. But first, we have a ton of great questions that have come in, and many of them revolve around program design. So we'll get to a few of those now. Carrie, there's a good question here about how you view potential financial returns of investments in VPPs relative to building and owning a traditional power plant. How do you compare the two?
Yes. So today, all of our VPP programs are funded through our demand side management adjuster. But I definitely think that there is a need to have a conversation about what is the most appropriate funding source. Because as that asset grows and it is kind of comparable to a utility scale resource, I think that that's definitely a policy conversation that needs to happen in just across the board, but specifically in our state as well.
And Seth, what are the compensation structures that are working and that need to happen?
I think that probably the thing that is most effective is it's one thing to have an incentive structure. It's another thing to have that incentive structure really easy to access. And so when you have a program that's set up so that, especially in the solar and battery world, where so much responsibility is put on the installer to figure out how to finance this thing, to do all the installation, to kind of get you set up, if you make it easy for the installer to access that incentive structure on behalf of the customer, then that just means that the installer can offer a much more compelling sale offer to the customer on, you should get a battery. I can get you basically half off this thing because of the mix of kind of federal, state, and APS incentives. So I would say that is the number one thing. I think that at the policy level, there is this big conversation happening in the industry about, yeah, how do we give utilities just direct incentives to build this stuff? How do we sort of put it as apples to apples against capital investments? That's a worthwhile conversation. But at the same time, there is so much rate pressure on utilities today to just keep up with load growth that this is kind of a yes and situation. If you weren't doing the VPPs, you'd have that much more capital requirement that you'd have to build out. That would drive rates up for customers. And so a lot of this stuff would happen. I don't want to say it would happen anyway, but it kind of has to happen. And it's just a question of like, how strongly do you incentivize sort of speed versus rate of return and other things?
I want to get to the load growth piece in more detail in a bit. Question for both of you here. What role do you see other stakeholders, contractors, aggregators, asset owners in supporting APS's VPP program specifically and partnering with EnergyHub?
Yeah, so I think we've really built a strong partnership with EnergyHub, and EnergyHub has built strong partnerships with OEMs of all types of technologies. And so I think, to the extent possible, we like to think about, the sky's the limit, right? So any technology that's interesting, we want to be looking at it, we want to be piloting it, we want to try it. We see that there is real kind of efficiency and savings to our customers also in kind of working directly with EnergyHub to deliver this one kind of complete asset. And so that is going to be our strategy on a going forward basis. We want to just continue to partner with Seth and his team to look at different types of technologies and to continue to challenge ourselves and try new things and scale it as much as possible. We've a really ambitious goal that our officer team has adopted for us to scale our virtual power plant pretty significantly over the next decade. And so in order to do that, we're going to have to try new things. We're going to have to develop new partnerships. And so we're excited to continue building those new relationships and building upon the ones we've already established.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an all the above. You need access to you need to let in anyone who can bring resources, right?
Mhm.
I think the word aggregator, again, back to that point about kind of language matters. It's interesting how the role of the aggregator has changed over the years. Aggregators remain really important in the C&I world in sort of the traditional role, right? They're out there they're finding the customers, they're enabling a building to connect to a DERMS. In a lot of cases, though, the role of aggregator has shifted toward either the device manufacturer or the device installer. So if you think about a company like Sunrun, they don't make batteries, but they sell and install a lot of batteries, and so they're performing a really important function as a quote unquote aggregator there. When you think about a company like Tesla, like GM, like Nest, Ecobee, any of these companies, in that case, the product itself is being managed by the manufacturer, and in that case, that manufacturer is the aggregator. So in a lot of ways, like the lesson we've learned is when you write your program design, when you file this with the commission, when you write terms and conditions for the end customers, it should be as broad as possible so that it doesn't really specify which entity is bringing what. You just are saying, like, basically anyone who brings resources that have certain operating characteristics that can perform at a certain level have an incentive to do that. And we don't care so much about like what the roles are of the different companies involved.
Hmm. Another question about enrollment. So two questions here lumped together. How are you actually enrolling participants? What are the most successful ways to get people enrolled? And then what are you seeing in terms of retention and attrition rates of participants?
Yeah. I mean, by far the most important thing is meeting the customer where they are. And so going kind of in-app with the manufacturer, having a variety of web experiences. in the case of solar and batteries, have a kind of the point of sale, and the customer is like signing the paperwork for their system. You kind of just need to, that touch point needs to be the touch point that drives enrollment.
Yeah, I would say it has to be as easy as possible for the customer. So I think a really great example of that is the just the significant kind of exponential adoption that we saw after we launched our APS marketplace with DR pre-enrollment. So when a customer would go to the APS marketplace, buy their thermostat, it was already pre-enrolled. So as soon as they installed it, they were in the program. You didn't have to mail in your receipts like in the old days. You didn't have to wait multiple bill cycles to see that that benefit. It all comes off at the top, and it made those thermostats even more accessible for our customers. And that's how we went from 0 megawatts in 2018 to 160 megawatts, 163 megawatts this summer, right? Because we've made it just so easy for customers. And I think that there's something to be learned about from that experience, excuse me, as we're thinking about EVs, right? And how can we make sure that we're partnering with EV manufacturers so that when our customers are taking delivery of their new car and they're in the app, to Seth's point, that they're being presented immediately with an APS program, because we believe that that's when they're going to be the most excited about it, right? So it's just really about thinking about the customer experience and how can you remove any points of friction so that it's kind of a no-brainer for them. They see the value in it and it's easy.
And is there anything you want to say about attrition rates? And if a customer is not having a good experience, what are you typically finding?
Oh yeah. Oh, go ahead, Gary.
Oh, nope. Go ahead, Seth. I can
I,
follow up.
I mean, attrition rates for these programs in general tend to be sort of in the 10 to 15% range annually. Of that, about half of it is not really attrition; it's just people moving, right? And so that means that your real attrition is somewhere in the range of like 7 to 8%. And that tends to be about the attrition rate of the sort of products themselves, the replacement cycle on which people are updating devices or whatever. So the true attrition rate on these things is low. But I will say, I mean, the industry. So I mentioned APS kind of leads, and they've got roughly 10% of their customers participating right now, roughly 200 megawatts. I, I I think, it would be great to get APS into sort of the gigawatt territory. And I think gigawatt territory for APS is kind of the model that any utility should be thinking of when they think about going big. You're only going to get to that if your attrition is under control, right? This has to be something that is just like kind of a no-brainer for the customer to participate in. And I mean, you mentioned at the very beginning, Stephen, that the role that the DOE is playing in this. Their liftoff report talked about like 160 gigawatts, I think, by 2030. If you boil 160 gigawatts down to nationwide to a utility serving about 1 million customers, which is what APS is, you get to about 1 gigawatt under management. And you look at where we are right now, it is entirely reasonable. It's taking it's something like 80,000 EVs, 30,000 batteries, 200,000 thermostats, a few hundred megawatts of C&I. Like, we will get there, but we will only get there quickly and stay there if we have attrition under control.
Yeah,
Carrie, did
I
you want
agree.
to comment on that?
No, I agree with all of that. And it's really just making sure that we're maintaining customer satisfaction so that we reduce that churn as much as possible. But that's also right about, the movement of customers. We actually have quite a bit of churn in our service territory. And so trying to stay ahead of that, making sure that we are prompting customers when they move and then maybe move into another property inside our service territory, that we're reminding them that they need to transition the participation over to their new account. It's just making sure that we are, to Seth's point, staying on top of it and making sure that we are removing those kind of barriers to keeping our customers participating.
Since we're talking about customers, I want to bring in another question here, and I'll leave it to you to interpret this question, but it's a good one. I'm curious to see how you answer it. This attendee asks, can you map the universe of users and customers for us?
Wow,
Map
that's a
the universe.
that's meta. Map the universe of users and customers.
Like what, I guess, like what are the different classes of customers? What are they? Again, I think it's open for interpretability, but
Yeah. I guess I will say I think that this is a really great opportunity to leverage AI and the data that we've got available, right? I envision a world when I'm thinking about 10 years from now and thinking about what is the virtual power plant or what could it look like when we are at a gigawatt. We really have to be better about accessing and leveraging the data that we have, right? Customers are not static, their needs are not static. And so making sure that we understand who our customers are, what their drivers are, will enable us to not only maintain their satisfaction with the programs, but also know what other programs they might qualify for, right? So that we're creating the best possible experience on the customer side while kind of leveraging all of these different technologies to support the grid. And I think we talked a little bit about my organization. That's the whole purpose of the customer to grid organization. It really is to bridge what customers want and what our grid needs. And so I just think we've got to find ways to better access data that there's so much data, right? But our systems just don't necessarily always talk to one another. And so I think we've got a real opportunity for improvement in that space.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'll
That's an
maybe go a
interest.
slightly different direction and just say that if you think about customer segments and sort of how you should think about a customer segment and participating in a VPP program. Um, when we were getting started, everybody said basically, we're not going to do residential because residential is too hard. And part of what made our business work is we said these people are already buying all these DERs. You can ride that wave and you can meet the customers where they are and get them to enroll. And so that works, I think, very well at residential. It works across DER classes. It extends somewhat into the sort of small and medium business category, but there is a point in what I'll just kind of loosely call the medium-sized business that is really underperforming or a sort of undertapped in VPP. So, I'm sitting here in an office building in Brooklyn. It's a 12-story building. It's got an HVAC system. They participate in a VPP program, which is remarkable because very few buildings like this participate in these programs. It's not easy to get that building management system or their HVAC system hooked into the utilities program. There's not an effective engagement campaign at most utilities to reach these customers because they're hard to reach. You're trying to find like the facilities guy somewhere in one of these buildings. So that medium business is really untapped. And then when you go to the large business and you start thinking, big manufacturing facilities, that tends to be one pretty tapped out. Like the regulator, or sorry, the aggregators have gotten access to those customers and brought them into sort of traditional, day ahead demand response programs, but they're not enabled at a technology level to do sort of fast acting grid management. They're not enabled to do distribution level load relief. And so there's a huge opportunity to do that. And I think over the next few years, as companies start investing in new building technologies, that'll probably unlock both the medium and large to do a lot more than they do today.
Hmm.
Yeah, we're really focused on those segments as well. I mean, obviously, our residential programs are performing very strongly. Our CNI programs, we have lots of room for improvement and growth in that space. And so my teams are really kind of going back to the drawing board and thinking about how can we kind of evolve our CNI programs so that we are attracting participation, right? We want to move beyond this one size fits all kind of solution as it relates to our CNI customers and really create more of a menu of options. We got some feedback from customers that committing to 18 events, it's too onerous for them. And so it's preventing them from wanting to enroll. Well, why don't we create kind of a menu for them to choose from, right? Different events, different compensation levels, and find what works so that we're growing and scaling that component of the portfolio. It's something that my VPP teams are really digging in on as we speak.
So Seth mentioned the backdrop to VPP deployment, which is now nationwide load growth. Arizona is setting new records for summer peaks, and I believe by 2031, you anticipate an additional peak of more than 13 gigawatts, and that peak demand is going to be, it's about a 40% increase. So talk about what is shifting, what is contributing to Arizona's growing peak, How does that compare with the rest of the country? And is that creating more momentum for VPPs?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Stephen. We see significant load growth happening, at both the residential and on the non-residential side of things. We've got quite a few data centers that are, of course, energy intensive and interested in siting in our service territory. And so, thinking about how can we meet all of this demand as it's coming, we see that customer-sited resources are just a no-brainer kind of part of the solution. I think at this point, with the load growth that we're seeing, it really is. And everything on the table, all of the above, what resources can we bring in to solve for this rapid load growth? And we view customer programs as an important part of that solution.
Something to remember is that when you think about meeting load growth, you often are talking about what is pretty similar to some of the peak demand challenges today, which is, okay, you've got a data center coming in. Do you have firm power to offer that data center all 8760 hours in the year? Maybe not. Maybe you've got 100 hours where you can't offer 100% firm service. That's a great time to bring in a VPP and say, okay, well, at that moment you have enough load flexibility to essentially guarantee firm power. But that kind of gets you back to this sort of planning framework of, if the folks who are doing system planning are always looking at the worst case scenario and always assuming that load is completely uncontrolled, you're never going to conclude you can plan to have it. But if those folks have a few years of experience under their belt using it, then they say, okay, yeah, we'll cover that 20 hours, 100 hours with load flexibility with VPPs.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most important benefits of the virtual power plant, right? It's truly a flexible resource. This isn't kind of the old demand response where you just push a button and then, like, whatever you got, you got. We're able to really kind of plan what load profile we want to provide, and we can schedule that accordingly. We can schedule those devices accordingly. And so we're able to really match what the system needs, and having that ability to leverage technology to flexibly kind of help out the grid. It's just, in my opinion, it's just very valuable.
And Seth, you indicated that load growth challenges were contributing to utility assessment of this resource. I'm curious, are there pockets of the country where load growth is particularly acute? How is that influencing general conversations about investment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are any pockets that are, I think there are places like Arizona, like Northern Virginia, a handful of other places that get, the most interest from either data centers or new manufacturing. But I think every utility is facing this. Something that I've been hearing a lot of utilities saying recently is that we've been so good at energy efficiency over the last 2 or 3 decades that a lot of planning teams have not been focused on planning for load growth. And so you're sort of like reestablishing a skill that was there and kind of was foundational for 100 years before, but has been sort of underused for the last few years. So I think this exists everywhere. I think anywhere that has rapid growth of EVs is worrying about both the system-wide load shape and the distribution effects, which I think makes it that much more important to get EVs into the mix. The EV problem is a little different because you can use EVs as part of a VPP, but we don't really have a term for that sort of distributed flexibility that you can deliver from EVs, where you can say, all right, we've got congestion way down into the distribution network. How can we just manage that on an everyday basis so that you're not shortening the life of pieces of equipment? You're not forcing yourself to reconductor pieces of the distribution grid. So there's a lot that I think ultimately just boils down to reliability and cost control. The more you can manage the load profile of this stuff for any number of reasons, the slower you can move in terms of building this stuff out. And I think that's really important because sometimes you just literally can't move fast enough.
Mhm.
We have some questions about policy and regulation. And of course, there's a really important regulatory conversation here. Maybe we'll turn to Arizona first and then have big picture regulatory reflections. So, Carrie, how are regulators at the ACC thinking about this resource. Are there any changes that you want to see on the regulatory front that would allow you to invest more in VPPs? How is the regulatory environment shaping up in Arizona around this?
So I shared earlier that our VPP is funded out of our DSM portfolio today, and it is. Our commission is starting to explore, though, kind of the elimination of the energy efficiency rules. And so I think that we're kind of setting ourselves up in Arizona to have a broader conversation about what should the future of these customer programs look like, and how do you fund them? What value do they bring? And so I think that it's a really perfect time to continue demonstrating the value that the virtual power plant provides to all customers. As I shared also earlier, you don't have to be participating in one of these programs to benefit from it. And so we just really need to make sure that we are clearly conveying that to our regulators as they're going through this process. I think as part of that also, it's evaluating what is the appropriate funding source. Should there be a return on these assets? It'll be interesting to see how those conversations and discussions unfold as the commission goes through the rulemaking process.
Seth, any reflections on either misperceptions among regulators or interesting moves that you are seeing to help support the resource?
Yeah, I think the biggest misperception comes around this sort of, I think, false binary of, is it better for DERs to be participating in energy markets or in utility programs? That seems like a choice that does not need to be made to me. A utility program like APS's, I mean, this is different in depending on where you are, but APS can take an aggregation of a bunch of DERs, turn that into a VPP or a bunch of VPPs, and then monetize those both in the energy imbalance market to manage transmission costs, to manage a bunch of things, and do distribution level stuff. But there are markets where regulators are forcing customers and I'll say again, quote unquote, aggregators to choose, do you go into the market or do you go into a utility program? And that just doesn't make any sense. The market programs tend to be a so-so way of pricing wholesale energy, and in some cases sort of transmission congestion. But no market today has the ability to price distribution level value in. And so the right thing that regulators could be doing, and in particular, any regulator that's trying to figure out how to implement FERC 2222 in their state, needs to be thinking about this as an and, not an or. Make it possible for DERs to participate in both. There's lots of software that can help solve these sort of hypothetical questions of, well, what if the distribution system is telling you one thing and the market's telling you another thing? That is by far the number one thing.
And since you mentioned FERC Order 2222, I know there's been it's been a very slow process of implementation. Do you think that eventual implementation in regional markets will have a positive impact on VPP deployment? Does the wholesale aggregation piece matter much?
I don't know. I don't think it's going to be. I don't think it's going to be as helpful as if, in a perfect world, I would have every state regulator find a way to just enable the utility to do this themselves. I think the underlying goal of how can you enable kind of direct participation in markets, I do think makes sense. I think you just want as much engagement of customers in grid flexibility programs as possible. I think it kind of goes back to what I said before. I think it's a false choice. But having said that, it's happening. It's happening slower than we want, but I think it's happening. And so now the question is, if you're a utility in a state that's moving forward with FERC 2222, how do you set this up the best? How do you do all the things Carrie mentioned before? Obsess over the customer experience, make it really easy for customers to participate, eliminate the reasons why they wouldn't participate. And that just basically brings me back to what I think is kind of a more complicated version of kind of what we do with APS and other markets today.
Earlier, Carrie touched on AI for customer segmentation. And it brings us to a big picture question about some of the interesting innovations ahead, either in technical implementation and operation. What are the changes to this resource that are coming ahead? Is it forecasting? Is it the diversity of resources? Carrie, what do you think is the most interesting trend that you're seeing?
So I definitely think it's a diversity of resources because it enables us. We like to, my team and I joke that we like to think about it as Tetris. How can we put these assets together in the most effective manner? But if I, look 10 years down the road and we're talking about, like Seth said earlier, having a goal to get to a gigawatt, to be able to have true grid edge visibility, leveraging AI and other technologies so that we are dispatching the assets in a way that automatically considers the customer experience. So, for example, uh, imagine you're in the middle of a yet another heat wave in Arizona. It's unrelenting heat, right? I don't want to have to call on your thermostat every single day in a week, Stephen. I want to be able to kind of have through artificial intelligence be able to smartly dispatch the asset in a way that provides the load profile that we need to provide to support the grid, and also at the same time automatically considers and incorporates the customer experience. And so I think getting smarter about the way that we're engaging with our customers, understanding what matters to them, questions like what temperature do you like to have your house at when you're sleeping, and building those things in automatically into the asset planning process and dispatch process. To me, that's the world we need to get to. But there's it's a long road between then and now. And what investments do we need to make in our internal systems so that they're talking to one another and we can truly get access to that data to actually get to that level of intelligent dispatch?
Seth, does
Yeah,
that world feel achievable?
it does completely. And I think AI is a must. You think about, like, imagine stepping into the cockpit of an airplane, right? And like somehow the walls and floor and ceiling are all covered with buttons and levers and stuff. So imagine that you're running the grid and you've got all the way down at the edge of the grid, you've got some EVs that you're making sure you get them charged without blowing up a transformer. You've got some batteries that you're charging at a certain time so they soak up the extra solar that's coming out. You've got some thermostats you're controlling. You've got some water heaters you're controlling. Now imagine that that's happening across 1 million customers, and you're trying to figure out how do I optimize all of that at the same time while also saving customers on the bulk system, while also firming up renewables. It's just not possible. You'd have 1 million buttons, and the only way you're going to do that is with AI. That's the only thing that you can do that's kind of computationally efficient and is going to get the reliability and predictability you need.
Any other technical innovations you see as important for expanding the industry coming up, Seth?
No, I actually think that the innovations that are going to be most important from honestly are cultural, right? Like, if I think about what sets our sort of largest, most successful customers apart, so the folks like APS and Duke and National Grid and Eversource, like, why did they succeed? They've all gotten good at iteration, and they're not afraid to try something that might be on the bleeding edge of a technology and figure out, like, where's the risk here? Is the risk in the implementation, the technology, or is it in the customer experience, or is it in the business model? Get to the sort of the point where you learn quickly. If it's working, double down on it. If it's not working, shut it down and try something new. And that, I mean, utilities historically have not been rewarded for that cultural flexibility. And I think that's what gets us to the scale.
And that brings us to the closing question. If let's say there's a utility or a regulator out there that's really skeptical about VPPs, what would you, Carrie, want them to know about your experience, the way you approach this as a utility that might get them to think differently about harnessing it?
So, my message would be everyone should do a VPP. Customers are adopting these technologies anyway. And if you are not developing programs to bring your customers into the fold to help meet your growing load needs, you're leaving something on the table, and you're leaving something on the table that's a really low cost resource. So I would just encourage, if you are not sure about it, reach out to some of the utilities that Seth mentioned. My team is always happy to talk about our experience with the VPP, and I'm sure you would find the same with, our friends at Duke and Eversource and National Grid. These people are very, very, very passionate about these technologies, and we love to talk about the experience, what we've learned, so that others don't have to kind of repeat the same mistakes that we've made. I don't even know that I would call them mistakes. I think that everything that we do is learning, and to Seth's point, iterating, right? Even if something doesn't exactly work out the way that we thought it was going to out of the gate, we don't view that as a failure. We really think that that's just an opportunity to learn and get better, and then apply that to other technologies. So I guess my overarching message is you should do your VPP. You should have a VPP.
Seth, any closing thoughts to the skeptics out there, the people who are hesitant? What do you know about the operation of this resource that you would want them to know?
Yeah, I think it's simple, right? These things are already big. They're incredibly reliable. They're an essential part of the resource mix going forward. Like, there's no world in which in which this is not kind of core to your strategy for decarbonizing or for dealing with load growth, period. And then to your point about the regulators, I think lots of different regulators are taking different approaches. The one thing is, I would say, if you're in California and you're a regulator, the rest of the country exists. And if you look at what's going on, there are lots of examples of how you could be doing this a lot better.
Well, this was a great discussion. I think I'm going to go make a sandwich after this. Um, the Seth Frater Thompson is co-founder and president of EnergyHub. Thank you so much, Seth.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your hot dog sandwich.
And Carrie Carnes is director of the Customer to Grid Solutions at Arizona Public Service. Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate both of your time. And if you want to go back and revisit this, we will have it live at latitudemedia.com/events. We will have an edited version on the Catalyst podcast feed, so make sure to subscribe there. And if you want to check out our reporting and our other work on VPPs, go to latitudemedia.com and sign up for our newsletter, and we've got it all there. Thanks so much to Seth and Carrie. We really appreciate it, and everybody have a wonderful day.
This is great. Thanks both.
Thank you. Bye, guys.